The crash had been violent, a roar of tearing metal and fire that had lit the alien sky like a second sun before silence swallowed everything. And now Captain Elias found himself as the only one breathing among the wreckage of the exploration ship Horizon, his body bruised, his lungs burning from smoke, his mind haunted by the faces of his crew who would never rise again. And as he staggered from the twisted hull into the strange world, he realized he was completely alone on a planet that was not only foreign but hostile, for he could already see patrol drones circling in the distance, their sharp red lights scanning the ground for survivors, their purpose clear: to eliminate intruders. And Elias knew that if they found him, he would be nothing more than another piece of debris on the ground. But fate took a strange turn when shadows moved silently from the tree line beyond the wreck, figures emerging cautiously, not soldiers but aliens who looked battered and poor, their large dark eyes filled with something he had not expected: pity, not malice. And though his training told him to fear the unknown, Elias lacked the strength to resist as they took hold of his arms and pulled him away from the glowing wreckage. Before the machines could detect him, dragging him through a maze of roots and into the cover of the dense forest, and there, in the hollow of a cave, he collapsed on the stone floor, gasping for breath, while the aliens whispered among themselves in a language he could not understand. Yet their tone was soft, uncertain, as if they were torn between fear of discovery and compassion for a wounded stranger. And Elias, though weak, caught fragments of their expressions: hesitation, hope, and the unmistakable weight of choice. For by saving him, they risked everything, perhaps even their lives. But still, they gave him water from a clay vessel. Still, they bound the gash on his arm with careful hands, and when he drifted into uneasy sleep, the last image in his mind was of a young alien child peeking out from behind a rock, eyes wide with curiosity and trust, as if to remind him that somewhere in this hostile universe, kindness still existed. And as night deepened, Elias dreamed, not of Earth, but of the unspoken bond being formed in the silence of that hidden cave, a bond that would change the fate of more than one world. When Elias awoke the next morning, the cave was dim except for the soft glow of a strange stone lantern that pulsed faint light, and he found himself surrounded by the same aliens who had rescued him, their large eyes studying him with both caution and wonder. And though their words were a mystery, they tried to speak with gestures, pointing to the bandages on his arm, offering him food that looked like dried roots. And Elias, realizing they meant no harm, nodded gratefully, chewing slowly while his mind raced with questions about where he was and why they had risked their lives to save a stranger. Yet as hours passed, he began to see more than just their faces. He noticed the exhaustion in their movements, the scars on their bodies, the way they flinched at every distant drone hum, and he understood that they were a people oppressed, hiding not from him but from something greater, perhaps the very machines that had been hunting him. And in their suffering, he recognized a reflection of humanity's own struggles across history. For these beings longed for survival, for dignity, for hope, just as his own kind always had. And slowly, with patience, they began to teach one another. Elias drawing pictures on the cave wall with a charred stick to show his world, his people, his journey, while the aliens responded with their own symbols, showing cities in ruin, families torn apart, and skies filled with machines that watched everything. And though no words passed between them, meaning flowed freely, and with each exchange, trust grew stronger. Until one evening, the young alien child who had peeked at him before brought him a small stone etched with a pattern, pressing it into his hand as though it were a gift of great value. And Elias, touched, realized that the child saw him not as an intruder but as something more, a friend. And in that moment he understood that what made humanity endure was not its strength or weapons, but its ability to share kindness, to inspire hope even in the darkest times. And so Elias began to teach in return, showing them gestures of comfort, laughter, and resilience, telling them stories in simple sounds and pictures of how humans had faced impossible odds and still found ways to rebuild. And though they could not understand his language, they listened intently, their faces softening, their eyes brightening, as if his very presence reminded them of something they had forgotten: that freedom was worth dreaming of, and that maybe survival was not enough if it came without dignity. And as the days turned into nights filled with whispered lessons and cautious laughter, Elias realized that though he had come here by accident, he had been given a role far greater than survival, for these aliens were learning what it meant to be human, and in their learning, he too was being reminded of the essence of his own kind. And so a bond was being forged in secrecy, fragile but powerful, a bond that would soon be tested when the world outside came searching once more. The days in the hidden cavern stretched into weeks, and Elias slowly regained his strength while the aliens continued to share their food, their stories through symbols, and their guarded smiles that grew warmer with every passing day. Yet deep inside his chest was a weight heavier than the wounds he had carried, for his heart longed for home, and though he had accepted his fate among these strange beings, the thought of Earth, of his people, of whether anyone still fought or even remembered him, never left his mind. And one evening, as the shadows danced across the stone walls, Elias noticed something in the hands of the elder alien, a device no larger than his palm, made of glassy metal that shimmered with strange light, and when the elder set it down before him, he realized it was not a weapon but a kind of transmitter, something that hummed softly when touched, and Elias's breath caught because it reminded him of human technology, not in its shape but in its purpose, for he could feel it reaching outward, faint and strained, as though calling into the void, and with trembling fingers, he began to draw again on the cave floor, this time showing the earth as a circle, then a line stretching from the cave to the stars, and the elder's eyes narrowed with understanding, nodding slowly before pushing the device closer, urging him to try. And though Elias had no idea how to operate such alien tech, his instincts as a soldier and survivor guided him, and after hours of trial, of pressing, of holding his breath while the device flickered with unknown symbols, he finally heard a pulse, a faint echo in the cavern, and his heart thundered, for this was not just sound, but connection, a thread stretched between worlds, and though his voice could not carry through the alien interface, he improvised, tapping patterns, sending rhythms that mirrored old distress codes, the kind humanity had once used when words could not, and he prayed that somewhere, some ship, some outpost still listened, still waited for any sign, and when silence followed, heavy and endless, despair nearly crushed him, but then the device answered, not with words, not even with clarity, but with a flicker of return pulse, as if Earth itself had whispered back, faint but alive, and tears filled his eyes. Not from sadness but from hope reborn, and when the aliens saw his trembling hands and shining face, they gathered close, sensing the gravity of what had happened, and Elias tried to explain with gestures, showing Earth again, pointing to the sky, then pointing to himself, then to them, making it clear that this connection was not his alone, but theirs too, for he knew then that if rescue came, it would not just be for him but for the ones who had saved him, the ones who had reminded him of humanity when all seemed lost. And as the cave filled with their quiet murmurs and the glow of the strange device pulsing like a heartbeat, Elias understood that a message had finally left this world, carrying with it not just a plea for survival but a story of compassion, a story that, if heard, might change the fate of both species forever. When the faint reply echoed back through the strange alien device, Elias felt a surge of life he thought he had lost forever, for in that pulsing return signal was proof that humanity was not gone, not scattered into silence, but still out there somewhere in the cold reaches of space. And though he could not understand the full message, he knew enough to recognize a pattern he once trained to use, an ancient code that carried only 3 words, "We hear you," and when his chest tightened with relief, he turned to the alien tribe whose faces glowed with curiosity, trying to explain with gestures that his people had answered, that hope had taken root again, and soon the quiet cave buzzed with an energy Elias had not seen before, because they too began to sense what was coming, the possibility that humans would arrive, that they were no longer alone in sheltering a stranger. From the stars, and for many nights, Elias worked with the elder to strengthen the signal, learning the rhythms of the device, sending coordinates drawn on cave walls and etched in dust, his desperation rising because he feared the fragile pulse could fade. But when the device's glow deepened and the air itself seemed to vibrate, he knew that his message had carried far enough to be heard clearly, and then came the waiting, the endless waiting that gnawed at him. Until one cold dawn, the sky above the ravaged world trembled with fire, streaks of light tearing through clouds, as human ships descended, their shapes sharp and metallic, so different from the alien curves around him. And Elias stumbled outside with the tribe, his heart pounding as he saw humanity return, not in whispers but in steel and flame. And when the landing craft opened, men and women in armored suits rushed forward, weapons ready, scanning the terrain as though the war had never ended. And when they saw Elias alive, gaunt but standing, they froze, then saluted with the respect reserved for the impossible. And in that moment tears blurred his vision because he was no longer forgotten. He was once again part of his people. But what struck him even harder was the way the aliens beside him did not step back, did not hide, instead standing tall in silent solidarity. And Elias knew that this was the test, the moment that would define whether humanity saw them as saviors or as threats. So he raised his voice, weak but firm, telling the soldiers what had happened, how these beings had saved him, healed him, fed him, and reminded him of compassion when war had stolen everything else. And though the soldiers shifted uneasily, though their helmets hid their faces, he pressed on, begging them not to see monsters, but friends. And in the silence that followed, the elder alien stepped forward and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning, and something in that sight pierced the hard armor of the humans, because they began to lower their weapons, some nodding slowly, as if realizing the truth in his words, and above them the ships hummed, ready to carry him back. But Elias understood that his rescue was no longer the story. What mattered was whether he left this world alone or whether he returned with those who had once chosen mercy over fear. And as the dawn broke fully, casting golden light on the wreckage of war and the fragile new bond forming in the dust, Elias stood between the two species, his voice carrying across the ruins as he declared that if humanity had truly returned, it must be for all, not just for one. And in that moment, the future of both hung in the balance. The human soldiers had come expecting to recover a survivor, not to find him standing side by side with beings their war councils had once labeled enemies. And as Elias stood between them, the silence weighed heavy, a silence that carried the risk of shattering into violence at the smallest spark, for one wrong word, one nervous movement, could decide the fate of not only those present but perhaps the fragile hope of peace itself. And though his legs trembled with exhaustion, he forced his voice to be steady as he told them the truth that the aliens they had feared were the reason he was alive. That, in his weakest moments, they had carried him when he could not stand, fed him when he could not eat, healed him when his wounds should have killed him, and most importantly, reminded him of something he thought long lost: compassion. But even as he spoke, he could see doubt flicker across the visors of the soldiers. Their formation tight and weapons angled, their training telling them that trust was a risk, and it was then that the elder alien moved forward slowly, his hand raised not in threat but in quiet greeting, a gesture of openness that drew every eye and froze every breath, and Elias prayed that no one would see it as a challenge, because if they did, the reckoning would begin in fire and blood, and the hope of unity would be lost forever. Yet to his relief, one of the commanders lowered his weapon and removed his helmet, revealing a face worn by war and time, eyes hard but not unfeeling, and she spoke quietly to Elias, demanding to know why they should risk their lives to protect a race that once stood against them. And Elias, heart-pounding, answered simply that sometimes enemies become saviors, and that the worth of a people is measured not by old battles, but by the choices they make when they hold another's life in their hands. And he reminded them that the aliens had held his life and had chosen to save it, though they had gained nothing in return. And as his words carried into the cold air, the younger soldiers shifted, their doubts cracking as they saw not a helpless survivor but a man willing to risk everything to protect those who had once been strangers. And the commander's face hardened with the weight of the choice before her, for she could order fire and be done with the problem, or she could risk the unknown and change the course of history. And just as she opened her mouth, the ground trembled, the sky filled with a low growl, and from the horizon new shapes emerged, ships not of Earth but of the enemy's kin, drawn by the signal Elias had sent. And fear jolted through the soldiers, weapons raised again as the air filled with the hum of power. But Elias lifted his hands and shouted above the roar that this was the reckoning, the moment when trust would either break or bloom, and if they chose fear, then everything he had fought for would die. Yet if they chose courage, then a new future could begin. And as the alien ships descended, doors opening not with guns but with figures carrying supplies and medicine, the commander's decision came sharp and clear. She ordered her soldiers to stand down, her voice firm but shaking, declaring that if enemies could save one human life, then humanity could save theirs in return. And so the reckoning did not end with fire but with hands reaching across divides. And as the suns rose higher, Elias knew that what began as his survival was becoming something far greater, the first step toward a world where humanity did not return for vengeance but for all, for every life worth saving. And the path ahead, it would be hard, but in that fragile moment, hope had triumphed. The morning after the stand-down, the air still carried the weight of what could have been war. The soldiers watching the alien ships with tense eyes while the aliens themselves moved, carefully, laying out crates of medicine and food as if every step might be misread. And Elias stood between them all, feeling like the fragile thread holding together two worlds that had never imagined sharing peace. Yet, as the supplies were opened and the sick among the humans were treated by alien hands that glowed with strange healing light, a new question burned in every mind: if one human was saved, if one fragile survivor could be protected, what about the others, still lost in the chaos of the universe? For humanity was not broken completely. Pockets of survivors still scattered across ruined colonies, still waiting, still hoping. And Elias's message had been clear: we return not for one, but for all. And though fear still lingered, suspicion thick in the air, the commander who had ordered her soldiers to hold their fire stood beside Elias and said in a voice that carried far that humanity had a choice to make, whether to see this alliance as a trick or as a lifeline. And her words struck deep, because behind every visor was a soldier who had lost someone, who had seen comrades vanish into the darkness of war. And now, before them was the chance, however dangerous, to pull the lost back from the void. And as the sun rose high, a decision was reached, not by orders, but by a quiet shift in the hearts of many, for they lowered their weapons not out of defeat but out of a fragile belief that enemies who saved lives might not need to remain enemies forever. And when the alien elder placed a hand upon his chest and vowed that his people would help search for every lost human they could find, Elias felt a tremor of hope stronger than any he had ever known, though the road ahead promised trials far beyond this single moment. For rumors already spoke of other alien factions who would not welcome such unity, whispers of battles waiting, In the dark, but still, the humans and their former foes began the work of building ships together, vessels that could carry them across the stars. Each bolt and weld a silent promise that this time they would not come back only for survival, but for salvation. And Elias, though scarred by everything he had endured, found himself at the heart of it all, his voice carrying in council chambers. His presence a reminder that one life saved had led to this fragile, unprecedented chance. And as the first fleet launched, carrying both human soldiers and alien healers, the silence in the command deck was heavy. Every face turned toward the stars where unknown dangers waited. Yet beneath that silence there was a fire, a determination that no longer belonged to one species alone, but to both, a shared vow that the reckoning was behind them, and now their mission was clear. They would search every ruin, every forgotten world, and they would not stop until every survivor was brought home. And as Elias watched the stars stretched before them, he whispered a single truth that filled the silence. They saved one of us, so now we return for all of them. And those words, simple yet unbreakable, became the banner of a new chapter in history, not just for humanity, but for every being who believed that survival was stronger when it was shared.